cycle assessment in the I see many of you have already added, and it seems like there's a wide variety of experience with LCA, from no experience to some people that do practice LCA. And that's just helpful for us to get an understanding of where you're all coming from. We are gearing this more towards the beginner side. So if you haven't heard of LCA, by the time you leave, you will have a good understanding and introduction to what that means. But hopefully for those of you who already practice LCA, you learn a few more things as well. So to start off with, we'll go through, Jana and I can both go through an introduction. I am actually located in Fitchburg, so I saw there were a couple people from Fitchburg in the chat. I'm from the Madison area and went to UW-Madison for civil and environmental engineering, and I also have my MBA. So I kind of like to pair the technical side with the business side. My background, I worked at Kohler Company for about 7 years in both the manufacturing setting, more on the environmental compliance side, and then was in new product development for about 4 years, working with the product sustainability engineering group, which Jana and several other of the TrueNorth co-founders were also part of that group. And really there worked a lot on the Design for Environment program, looking at how to improve the sustainability position of products for the company. At TrueNorth, I lead our operations, and I'm also very involved in project work as well. Everything from sustainability strategy, so working with teams just looking to get started and understand the basics, to setting up ways to report out and integrate programming at their companies. We work with a lot of manufacturers in a variety of different sectors. And then I also do a lot of work related to marketing claims. So how to take data and translate that, LCA data, translate it to consumer-facing messaging, making sure that it's credible and accurate and verified, as well as supporting clients with environmental product declarations. Some of you may be familiar with those for the building products industry. I will go and pass it off to Jana for her introduction.
Hi, everybody. My name is Jana Fogarty, and I'm actually located up in Plymouth, Wisconsin, pretty close to Road America, for those who are familiar with that area of the state. I went to Michigan Tech University for materials engineering, and did about 8 years of process engineering, materials engineering, in the Kohler cast iron foundry, before I joined the sustainability team at Kohler. Did life cycle work, as well as helping with design for environment sustainability type work, kind of pairing with the manufacturing groups. And I did that for about 10 years before joining the TrueNorth team about 3 years ago. So it was really helpful to have that manufacturing background when doing the sustainability work at Kohler, and it's been really, really fun to have that sustainability and manufacturing kind of backgrounds together when going into consulting, because it just is really helpful for when clients are wanting to explain their processes, and you have a little bit of a background on how those might work. It's been super fun being a part of a consulting firm the last few years, because we've gotten the chance to see so many different types of materials and processes and work with so many different people. And it's been really, really interesting. I mean, things from, things in the food industry to, HVAC to, composting, clothing. It's been really, really interesting to see sustainability work in all the things that, are so integrated with our daily life. So, yeah, I'll pass it back to Olivia.
Thanks, Jana. Before we get started, we wanted to also ask through a poll what your background is. So I know we don't represent every function here, but could you answer in the poll? I think that Lorenzo will be posting Are you a sustainability advocate and part of the community and you just care about these efforts? Do you have a background in any of the other functions listed here? If it's other, feel free to type it in the chat. We'd be curious to hear more about where you're coming from today. We'll just give it a little bit of time. And I think Lorenza or Sam, you can let us know when you see a good amount of responses there.
Yeah, we have about 80% responded, so I will put it here and share the results for you.
Great. So it looks like about 24% sustainability advocate and then a good thread, other. So 34% other. So feel free to type in the chat. Looks like some education background, auditing, public sector, R&D, church interest, different events. Great. Thank you for sharing. That's really helpful to understand. Okay. So to let you know what we'll cover today, we're going to talk a little bit more about our journey and how we got started using LCA to make sustainability decisions. Then Jana will take us into a deeper dive on what is LCA and talk more in depth about that. And we'll wrap up with some case studies, which I think can sometimes be the most exciting part. Hopefully all things will come together when we talk about how data is being used to support decision making and a little bit of the regulatory aspect as well. As we go through, feel free to type questions in the chat. We'll kind of monitor them. If we can't answer them in real time, we will. Otherwise, like Lorenza said, we'll follow up at the very end or an email if we can't get to your questions. So for the TrueNorth team, we see sustainability as a journey with all the clients that we see and in the different areas they're coming into it at. Most of our backgrounds are from engineering or technical sectors, whether that be mechanical engineering, chemical, environmental engineering, material science. We also have a team member who is trained and worked as an industrial designer for many years. None of us started out our career in sustainability. And I think, for many of you, probably not as well. And so that gives us all different perspectives when we're coming at this as we work with different stakeholders and can bring those unique perspectives together. Our founding team built up the Design for Sustainability program at Kohler for several years. And through that time, we really helped to move and influence the culture and shift perspectives about sustainability from being something that is just the right thing to do, which is good, but to have the company and business see it as a business value add and actually a way to drive innovation as well. And so we'll talk more about that as we go along. I like to share this slide because I think it can give you an idea. This doesn't represent everyone and all different stages of the journey, but in the kind of corporate world and for many businesses, this is a good example of where companies may be coming into sustainability from. Every organization is coming from a different starting point. And like I mentioned, when we were at Kohler, we helped to kind of shift that culture from that point of acceptance. So you see stage 3 being acceptance of sustainability being something we need to think about, pollution prevention focus or eco-efficiency, to really being something that was more about innovation, a key to innovation. One of the ways we drove that was through using life cycle assessment. If you haven't heard about the Waste Lab at Kohler, you should definitely look it up. Teresa at TrueNorth was the champion for that effort that has now won awards for turning landfill-bound materials into beautiful products of high value. And we definitely used a life cycle assessment data to support the sustainability story there and ensure that it truly was a more beneficial product for the environment. So we'll talk more about how we got to that place of making credible decisions using data to support, like life cycle assessment. One key thing that we really did was to shift from just an operations focused mindset, so manufacturing operations and reduction of impacts there, to thinking about impacts coming from products and the full life cycle of those impacts outside of just our own four walls. And since the company is in the business of selling products, not just making manufacturing plants, that shift helped to bring in additional stakeholders and expand our perspective on where there were opportunities to make different decisions to impact sustainability in the right way. And Jana, I'll pass it off to you for this one.
Yeah, so when we first started, like Olivia kind of mentioned, our main focus was on the attributes instead of the outcomes, with kind of hyper attention on our owned operations, the manufacturing pieces that happened within our own plants and within kind of the Kohler walls. Um, but and at that time, it was really considered best practice to do it that way. But as we started to implement those practices, we kind of learned some important lessons along the way. And some of the goals that we set, such as, zero waste to landfill by 2035, or, reducing water use within manufacturing. Some of those things, aren't necessarily bad things, but they're also maybe not the best places to focus our energies that we have to, spend time on the sustainability goals. And so just we learned a lot of things along the way, and it really helped us to identify where we should be spending our efforts. One of the things that we want to talk about a little bit today is the case study of the very first life cycle that our team did. It really exemplifies the learnings that we had on decision making with sustainability, and especially with the sustainability LCA data, that keeping that in mind. The Reynosa, Mexico team was the first team that kind of reached out to us and requested support for some of their ongoing efforts to reduce their environmental footprint. And because, Kohler Corporate had each operation sort of designated sustainability champion, this gave us the chance to start some different conversations all across the company, so we could understand what opportunities might be there with a little more clarity. We designed a system life cycle assessment plan that appreciated the existing value add system the products were created in. Some of the key things that we learned from the system LCA, system level LCA results show that we could justify both with reduced environmental impact and financial savings, putting in a new HVAC system at the plant, doing some material and process replacements, and working really closely with the new product development team to identify some plant level challenges and solutions that they had thought about. Go ahead. After we implemented putting in a new HVAC system and replacing a sound deadening spray that was used, and replacing that with absorbing sound pads, we conducted an update to the system level LCA and learned that we were able to reduce the greenhouse gas emissions from the sound spray to the sound pads by about 10% with that replacement. And also by doing the HVAC system replacement, it was about a 9% greenhouse gas savings. And, there was some people, we talked a little bit about the HVAC system because when we first went to do some of the metering and talking with the people in the plant, we were very surprised at that when they told us that there was air conditioning because it was between 90 and 100 degrees most of the time we were in the plant. And so by installing this new HVAC system, we were able to have it use 9% or have 9% lower greenhouse gas emissions, overall, but also it was a much more comfortable environment in the plant. So the those that work down there were very, very excited that we were able to kind of justify that, because it definitely was a big upgrade there. So just kind of goes to show that, sometimes there are really great opportunities that can be found that life cycle can sometimes help identify that you might not notice in other ways.
Yeah, I think that's a great point. And for that example, we like to talk about triple bottom line too. So if some of you have heard of people, planet, profit being the three legs of the stool for sustainability, this example really helped the business see how financially, environmentally, and for the people and the plant, because the plant was now cooler and it was a better environment to work in, that it achieved those three benefits. So that's, if you haven't heard of LCA, hopefully this gives you a little bit of understanding. We're going to go now more into how data can support and show us where impacts are, and a little bit about how to do an LCA from a high level before we go into the detail. So when we do a life cycle assessment, we'll use LCA for short. We start with data that sometimes can feel like this. The data that we collect is in the form of energy data, so utility information, water consumption, waste information, all from the manufacturing facility. We look at production volumes, bills of materials, which mean kind of the recipe for the products, all of the chemicals that go into it. We look at supplier locations and transportation distances for supplied materials. And we even look for products that have maybe an installation or a maintenance phase, such as chemicals that are used to clean it, or electricity if it is plugged in. We look at those types of things, as well as end of life. Where does the product go once we're finished with it? Is it recyclable? Is it reusable? Or does it go to the landfill? So we have all of these different types of data. What we do with that data is then we sort it. We use Excel. So some of you may be Excel wizards, some of you maybe hate Excel. For us, we love Excel because we use that to sort all of the data that we have. And then we will sort some more and do some calculations with that data. And then we'll even arrange it and understand, are there data gaps? Are there key assumptions that we might need to make? We have secondary data sets we can use to fill in those gaps. And then we use a modeling tool. So life cycle assessment, we'll talk more about this, but there's a modeling tool that we put all of this data in, and it will output the environmental impact results, such as greenhouse gas emissions and human toxicity factors. And we'll look at patterns across that data to evaluate what the data is telling us. And when we do all of that, then the point that we hope to get to, and we call, and we do get to, is seeing a story within that information. That story helps to guide focus on the areas for discussion with teams, the improvement opportunities. It may tell us things that blow our mind that we didn't think about. I would say many times when we're working with clients, they may think that the end of the life of the product, or maybe the transportation of the product because it's coming from overseas or materials are coming from overseas, are really high, when actually the manufacturing of the product or the mining of a specific very intensive mining material is where the impacts are. It may not mean that you have a lot of opportunity to change that, but at least you understand the story that the data is telling you about the full life cycle of the product or service that you're looking at. So this has really helped to open people's minds on what they can do with that information. And we really help the teams talk about different ways to maybe work with suppliers or evaluate different manufacturing technologies or materials if those show up as areas of opportunity from the LCA. So that's a very high-level visual example of life cycle assessment. I like to show this slide with the image on the left because it shows you what we're evaluating in LCA. We're evaluating everything from supplier operations, the raw materials, the mining, if any materials. The transportation is represented by the white. The green is the operations impacts of the company that owns those operations. The use phase of a product would be, like I said, if there's any cleaning or maintenance, if there is electricity or natural gas consumed, the use phase. And then the end of life, where does it go? So it is a really powerful tool and practice that's used to give you a data-based understanding of environmental impacts across whatever scope you're looking at. And this, in the Reynosa example that Jana explained, this, that example really helped to open the business's eyes as to how this can be used to not only see the impacts, but also where they're coming from to identify those areas of opportunity. And this can be done all the way from an individual product to an entire organization or enterprise. Another example of how it changed our thinking is more on the enterprise level, because early on in our journey, like Jana mentioned, the focus was on impact reduction on everything that the company could directly influence within its own four walls, so the manufacturing facilities. This primarily meant setting goals around greenhouse gas, water, and waste reduction in the plants. And while this was a very common and logical place to start, what we didn't realize was that the amount of impact that we were trying to influence represented less than 5% of the company's overall impacts. So that means even if you throw all your best resources and money towards reduction goals, it wouldn't have that much effect overall. And so as you can see in this image, areas such as supply chain and product use could make up the majority of greenhouse gas impact. So that's really an area that you need to focus on understanding more to have a more direct effect on larger goals. So by using the data to determine areas of focus, this helps to make sure that you're dedicating those resources. Everyone's strapped on time. Companies have very limited resources, but the resources that you have towards the areas of real opportunity and biggest opportunity first. So for example, maybe you think that the direct operations or owned operations on the left-hand side here have the biggest impact because that's what you see and that's what you think about all day. But after life cycle assessment, you realize your supply chain and specific suppliers and suppliers of certain materials even are really driving up your greenhouse gas or some other environmental impact because most of what you do is actually assembly. So there's not much impact. So this would prompt you to explore what suppliers or materials are driving this impact and then consider how you would collaborate with them or potentially design products differently to reduce this. This is exactly why maybe some of you work for companies that get sustainability requests from your customers because your impact is also part of their impact. And right now, large companies like Walmart, Amazon, Google are all looking for their suppliers or their customers to help support their goals as well. When we use data to inform strategy, it's helpful to be mindful of looking at impacts instead of and outcomes instead of just attributes or product aspects. So on the left-hand side here, you can see things that are probably common for you for marketing of products, like how much recycled content is in a product, the product efficiency, percent of recycled or renewable materials or compostable. And those are all features that customers might be looking for. But to ensure you avoid greenwashing or saying things that are not actually true, it's important to make sure that changes you make to products or services are truly affecting product impacts, such as greenhouse gas emissions or human toxicity, because these are true measures of outcomes. So one example of this is we've seen where recycled materials have replaced virgin materials in a product. But due to the energy intensity to process those recycled materials, the product with recycled materials actually has a higher carbon footprint as compared to one made with virgin materials. That's just one example, but there are countless examples of this type of thing when data on impacts and outcomes haven't been used to help direct improvements and measure the true benefit. And there is a lot going on right now in the EU related to regulations around sustainability marketing and messaging, and really ensuring that data is the base to inform what can be communicated. So that was just a lot of content. Now Jana is going to take us a little bit deeper into LCA to hopefully help explain a few more concepts to you.
So yeah, diving in a little deeper to the process of creating an LCA and kind of what that looks like. An LCA accounts for inputs, things like materials, water, energy, and outputs, things like the product that comes out that you're selling, waste and emissions, those types of things, at the typical life cycle phases. So those simplified down are, things that happen that are like supplied materials, things that happen sort of upstream of your a company's typical operations. The typical operations, which include things like manufacturing, distribution, installation, and then you have the use phase. And after the use phase is a product's end of life. Common impact results from using the lifecycle software are things like global warming potential, greenhouse gas emissions, human health, resource depletion, water scarcity. These are all kind of impact categories that many times we look at. The most common one that is discussed is usually, related to global warming potential, and that's greenhouse gas emissions. But there's many other things that can be considered. And depending on the materials that are used or what the product is, it's important to be able to look at the impact categories that are most applicable for your project. This slide here also shows the so we wanted to also explain a few things that you might have heard about and how they fit into life cycle assessment. And those terms are cradle to gate and cradle to grave. Cradle to grave is a pretty common way to look at a life cycle assessment, and it's taking the results of the life cycle all the way from the raw material extraction out of the ground to manufacturing the product, to its use phase, and to disposal or recycling of the product kind of at the end of its useful life. So that life cycle would be considered a cradle to grave life cycle. Sometimes it's only looked at as what's called a cradle to gate life cycle. And that is something where you're really just focusing on the impacts of the raw material extraction and manufacturing. And then those impacts kind of stop when the product leaves the factory, leaves the gate of the factory and goes on. Sometimes if you're looking at something that, maybe something like insulation, you might look at cradle to gate, but then also add on the end of life. So these kind of system boundaries that you might have heard about are really important because they do affect which parts of the product are assessed in the life cycle assessment. And the overall results can really be different depending on what's included. So, understanding what the boundaries are for a project that either you're involved with or that you're looking at results of are really key to understanding and interpreting the results. So this, sorry, just find my notes here if I can listen. So this overall process of completing an LCA can sometimes feel a little overwhelming, but understanding the required steps that are kind of defined here really is helpful. So the first step is to identify and define the goal and the scope of the project. The next step is to look into the data collection. So this is one of the most time-consuming parts many times of doing an LCA, because typically the data has to be gathered from a lot of different places within a company or within suppliers. And finding that right information in the context to help you collect it can sometimes be tricky. So that sometimes is a time-consuming piece. But once you kind of complete that and you get to the modeling phase, for those of you on the call who are a little bit more have a little more engineering kind of mindset, that's kind of the most fun part, is building the LCA model, that modeling phase. It's the part where you're, organizing the data, digging into the detail, and kind of learning all of the information that's behind the data is kind of the most fun part, I think. The analysis and interpretation is also pretty interesting. It's when you're, taking the results and determining, hotspots in the manufacturing or identifying improvement opportunities. It's almost like, brainstorming, interesting things or things that could be done to reduce impacts, of a product, but having all of the information already in front of you. So it's pretty fun there. And then lastly, if the project results are going to be shared externally, then there's kind of a report writing and EPD creation step, and then a third-party verification step in order to allow those results to be shared externally. So that's a little bit of kind of the process of creating and using an LCA. When you go to create the LCA, there are many different LCA software tools that can be used. These are 6 that are common, but there definitely are others out there. And there's kind of, benefits and drawbacks of each tool because of just kind of the functionality that they have and how you might use it. So we have used SEMA Pro the most because we have found it to be really detailed in helping us, really dive into some of the data. But there are many other softwares out there that are very helpful, and depending on the situation you need them for, their functionality is a best fit for what is being used. So this slide kind of just explains, how powerful the benefits of LCA can be. It can really benefit stakeholders in a variety of ways, and it's really important to consider what outcomes that you're looking to accomplish, when you're kind of at the point of starting the LCA. Substantiation, who values the substantiation? Marketing and sales, it kind of provides the necessary data for those external disclosures, and also supports, risk reduction because you're kind of understanding the impacts a little bit more. LCA can help highlight opportunities. That can be valued by many, parts of the organization, from R&D to product development, operations, supply chain. It helps identify opportunities at, every life cycle stage, from raw material extraction all the way through, the product's end of life. And that really just drives the innovation engine internally, to help think of things all the way from sourcing, product design, manufacturing, logistics. Kind of the possibilities are endless there. I'll say it also gives, internal credibility. So, data is important. We're a very data-driven culture. And, teams want to really understand that, what they're getting into, and making sure that they're, doing something that's not going to come back to bite them later. Then LCA can also be used for metrics. It can help set up your metrics. It can help track progress to different impact categories. And that kind of matches up with what Olivia mentioned earlier with the triple bottom line of people, planet, and profit. One thing that's really important to think about when you're looking into an LCA, and this kind of happens during that goal and scope phase, is the functional unit. So a functional unit is the specific measurable amount of a product or service that you're studying to compare its environmental impact. And that's kind of a fancy way of saying that it helps you standardize the assessment so you can really compare different products or services that are doing the same job. We have a couple examples here because I feel like that's a lot of words that might not mean something if you're not used to looking at it. So an example of a functional unit is a container that holds 24 ounces of drinking water for personal use over 1 year. This can help you compare a plastic water bottle to a metal water bottle to a water bottle that might get thrown away after every use. And lets you look at how much impact each bottle has, how much energy, water, materials for 1 year of use. So when you use the same functional unit for, for all the products that you're comparing, you can really see which one is better for the environment based on the same conditions. Without the functional unit, it's a little bit like comparing apples to oranges. It's hard to really understand if you're looking and comparing the same things. So in summary, a functional unit really is just the unit that you measure everything against to make sure your comparison is fair and meaningful. Another example of a functional unit is when looking at a hand dryer versus a paper towel, might be 100 pairs of dry hands. And again, you're looking at the impact difference of, paper towels or hand dryers. And I feel like that's an example that we talk about a lot and gets talked about a lot. And so we'll give you an opportunity in a few minutes to share what you think might be the best way to dry your hands. And so be thinking about that a little bit. Another functional unit example is one smartphone produced. So this could be used to compare the impact difference between different manufacturing of phones or phone materials or technology that's used to produce the product. So here we have an example of how we might define goal and scope when we're talking about the hand drying that I sort of mentioned a minute ago. And we're going to look at things like goals and outcomes, existing information, and function and systems. So, things to consider are, what is the goal and scope? What is the goal and application of this LCA? So you might be trying to determine the sustainability position of various hand drying options to be used when you're comparing alternatives, hand dryers versus paper towels. Things to consider are who is your audience and how might they define a successful outcome. Many times this is some internal, but a lot of times the information might be used later for marketing, depending on what you find out. Something to consider is what information already exists. So, there might be previous studies that were done, or you might have information that was done for, different research projects, or, there might be rules that exist for different assumptions that will be used. And then, other questions to ask for the function and the systems are, again, this is just helping you define that functional unit. So what function does the product system provide? In this case, drying hands. How is that function measured? By 100 pairs of dry hands. The system boundary, which we talked about a little earlier, here is cradle to grave.
I think this is a good example because this was actually from a client of ours who produces electric hand dryers. So they had wanted to understand how they could talk about the sustainability position of their products, which is why you see it being a comparison. It doesn't always have to be a comparison, but in this case, they were interested to actually see the differences between products, and cradle to grave was really important because the use phase, the electricity from the hand dryer and the paper towels being used is really important to consider. That's where much of the impact could come in. So that's why it's cradle to grave versus cradle to gate.
And here's where we want to introduce the next poll. So want you to think about which products might have the highest which product has the highest greenhouse gas impact for drying 100 pairs of hands? So your choices in the poll are the hand dryer, an efficient hand dryer, a paper towel, or a paper towel made from 100% recycled content.
I'm very curious to see
I know, I'm really
what people
curious.
think here.
This is like a discussion I feel like we have often.
Yeah, there's a lot of common things I think in even personal decisions and what you use that come into play that we're like, oh, it'd be really helpful to have some LCA results to consider decision making outside of just the business context. So this is an example that may relate to a decision you make in the future with what method to dry your hands with.
So it looks like this group thinks that the best option is to use an efficient hand dryer. And interesting to think that to see the variation there between the paper towel and the paper towel with recycled content, and how many people think that the one with the recycled content also has higher. It's always interesting to see, everyone's got such different opinions and reasons for those opinions, and that's why it's really, really helpful to have the data, because there's so many different thoughts that go into making choices. All right. So
drum roll for the
results. So the results of the comparison that was done revealed that this, hand dryer products exhibit somewhere between 79 and 97% fewer environmental impacts when compared to using a paper towel with zero recycled content. When you're comparing a paper towel with 100% recycled content, the Excel dryers also still demonstrate 82 to 96% fewer impacts. So it's interesting to note that life cycle impacts of dryers are primarily driven by the use stage, right? So making the hand dryer does not matter as much as the efficiency of running it. But the impacts of the paper towel are mainly driven by the raw materials and the manufacturing of them, because they're kind of a single use item. So it's just interesting, because if you don't look at the entire life cycle in all the stages here, it doesn't really give you the full picture.
Yep. And so this was specifically for Excel dryers. I'm sure many of you have used their hand dryers before. And just to note with that verification piece, because they wanted to talk about these results externally, this had to go through third-party verification to make sure that the assumptions and the data was verified. It even had, because it's a comparative LCA with two different products, it had to have 3 people on a panel to review the results. So this is very important part, like we said before, on any marketing claims or messaging need to be reviewed, because with LCA, there are some assumptions that go into it. There's a lot of data, like you saw, and any slight change in that could skew the results. So that verification piece is very important. And overall, with this example, of course, probably just air drying your hands would be the best case scenario, or using your pants. So maybe this makes you think differently. It seems like the majority of you did guess right, and that paper towels was the highest impact. But now you have a little bit more detail when thinking about this in the future. And now we're going to talk about data to support decision-making with a few more case studies. One thing we like to show is that we talk about data and data modeling. That's the life cycle assessment that we have been mentioning. And we like to think about decision-making around sustainability, or design for sustainability, as we call it, with a couple things in mind in that process. So that's the data from LCA, maybe from other sources as well, with the business context. And if you overlap those two, like you see here, that helps provide these insights. So the business context could come from organizational knowledge, business pressures, external pressures, customer insights, existing processes that you have, or different aspirations or values or goals that the company has. So by combining these two, that helps to give you understanding of what you might move forward on to prioritize. And it's important to note, a lot of the data may show you one thing, but if you have no ability to change the material or the technology, or if there's certain business pressures, you can't always just do what the data might be telling you to do. So combining that data analysis with the human-centered mindset helps to understand what strategy you can use going forward. There are 3 different levels of LCA modeling that we talk about commonly, and each of these 3 help with different outcomes. One is a product level model. So think of a single t-shirt. It's just going to look at the impacts of that t-shirt by itself to understand, the full life cycle impacts of that. We also have something called a system level model, and that's an efficient practice for modeling multiple products or product categories that have a common process or materials in their value chain. So the scope of that could be defined by product or product category, or it could be one single manufacturing plant, or maybe it's like a business unit level because there's similar manufacturing or supply chain that go into that. So that's a more complex way to model, but it gives you a lot more flexibility with the outcomes and the results of that model because you are going across many products rather than just one product. And then the final level is an enterprise level LCA, and that estimates the total environmental impacts of the business overall and highlights the relative contribution of different parts of an organization. So you can see in this image, there could be 3 different business units, and you can understand which of those business units might be contributing more impact than others. This one can also be used to measure scope 1 through 3. So if some of you, I see a scope 3 comment on there, if you're familiar with that, we can use LCA for scope 1 through 3 reporting for enterprise LCA. So what personal decisions might we make with sustainability in mind, and how might data be able to support that? So you might be going to the store and you may be thinking about, should I use a paper or plastic bag to carry my groceries home? Or how about my cloth bags? Hopefully you bring those or you don't forget them. There has been a study done, I'm sure multiple studies done, to look at life cycle assessment comparing shopping bags. And you can see here the functional unit they defined as one use or a single use of a bag. You could probably argue that you might want to look at the mass that it was able to hold as well. But in this study, it shows that if you just use a single reusable bag once, that's obviously going to have a very high greenhouse gas impact as compared to the more times you use it, the impacts go down. That seems pretty obvious. You can see the paper here, like the paper does have a higher impact than the polyethylene bag. And then we add in the water consumption piece. So this is looking across another category. And we always think it's important to look at different impacts and not just one single impact. And I know sometimes we can get tunnel vision focused on just carbon or greenhouse gas, but it's helpful to look at water here and look at that impact as well. And paper and the reusable bags take a lot of water to make. This study doesn't take into account things like decomposing and the release of toxic substances that might come from a plastic bag, or the biodegradability of a paper bag, and the fact that the paper bag can be recycled at a higher rate than plastic bags. So there are things it doesn't always take into consideration. So it is important to understand what outcomes are the most important to you. Of course, the best option is to use whatever bag you have for as many uses as possible. The longer you can use a bag that's already been made, the better it becomes, because it lowers the impacts that took to create that bag in the first place. But hopefully you can see here how there are these examples of using data to support decision-making can help at least give you a better understanding of what those impacts are for decisions you might be making. And we always like to say that a truly sustainable product is one that is never produced, because the reality is that it takes things to create other things. So It's always important to just consider the trade-offs and the benefits of the decisions you're making. There's never going to be, always a perfect option, but by using the data against our ideas that we have, we can make sense of and balance the decision trade-offs and understand what more sustainable can mean in a credible way. Not that it is a sustainable product, but what is truly the better option out of the options that we have in mind. And I'll let Jana take over here.
Yeah, so this is a discussion question that those of us who are responsible for doing the laundry in the household might be interested to think about. But so it's a study that was done by jean manufacturer Levi's of how often should you really wash your jeans. And in their life cycle, assessment that they did, they found that as consumers take care of their jeans, and the method they found, that how we as consumers take care of our jeans and the method of cotton cultivation, those are the two highest impact areas. So digging into that a little bit further, looking at the entire life cycle of a pair of jeans, consumer care makes up about 40% of the overall impacts. So that's kind of the use phase, right? So that means that we as consumers have the opportunity to lower that piece of the environmental impact pie based on our own actions. And the fabric production makes up 27% of the impacts. So, Levi's, that's where they're kind of working with their suppliers and their other partners to try to see what they can do to reduce that. But, if they only did something or we only did something, there's still a lot of opportunity there. So looking at that consumer care portion, and kind of the patterns that the consumers have, Levi's learned that if we wear our jeans 10 times before washing them, we could reduce the energy usage of that, of wearing them by about 77%. Lowering our washes to maybe washing them every 5 times instead of the standard 2 to 3, we would still be lowering our impacts. Kind of expanding this thinking out a little further, considering how it might affect washing the rest of your clothes. Obviously, it's important to wash our clothes. We need to be clean and the clothes need to be clean. But just considering if an item really needs to be washed before throwing it in. I know, like, sometimes my children don't want to put their clothes away, so they just take them right from the pile and put them back in the dirty clothes. But obviously, there's always a little bit of a balance here, but the clothes that we wear also, can help that. So wearing clothes that are really durable, maybe having clothes, depending on what things you do, having the colors or patterns of your clothes have to be able to be worn more before they're washed. Just little things like that do make a big difference. And ultimately for Levi's, these kind of findings led them to create a campaign, a wash less campaign, and kind of use those impact hotspots to point out to consumers how they could lower the impact of the jeans by washing them less. I like the image there: cram like a college kid, load the laundry machine to capacity, and save 300 liters of water, per month. So there's just a lot of interesting things that we as consumers can do. Things like, using cold water to wash our clothes, maybe line drying when it's possible, donating clothes when we're finished with them, or passing them on to someone else rather than throwing them away. All of these things kind of show how life cycle assessment data on jeans were tied into a really creative campaign by Levi for consumer education. And that can, really reduce impacts of Levi's jeans by about 40%. So, we talked here about intentional decision process, and that's exactly what better can look like when a company intentionally makes decisions based on data related to sustainability. So, as you can see, a bunch of fancy sustainability terms aren't used in how they communicate to consumers, we can make this simple and easy to understand.
Thanks, Jana. I know we just have a couple minutes left, but I wanted to touch on how you've learned about our journey and how we started using LCA, and hopefully a little bit more about the details on how to conduct an LCA and what it means with some case studies and examples. So to wrap up, I wanted to briefly touch on the regulations and policy piece, because LCA is highly technical and it's a data-based approach, but it can be used to not only guide policy decisions around technology and specification of certain products or materials, but also to provide accurate data when reporting externally. So you may not be familiar with some of the regulations or the terms on this slide, but if you are, know that LCA can be used as the data engine to support many of these efforts, whether it's transparency for EPDs in the building industry, or greenhouse gas accounting, or even to support marketing claims, as you saw today. So I know we are almost at time, but if you wouldn't mind just typing in the chat if there was something new you learned or any aha moments for you, we'd love to see what your thoughts are. And thank you all for joining today and staying with us as we covered a lot of content. Please feel free to reach out if you have any questions after this. I know Stain Dane will provide our email contact and information as well.
And we'll look through the chat and follow up on questions that you guys shared.
Thank you so much. That was great. I really learned a lot. And I love the thing that I learned was I knew that study about the bags. I've heard about it a million times, but seeing it laid out so neatly was so nice. So nice. We might need to share that on social media. That
Yes, you definitely should. Yep. It's a good visual.
Thank you everyone for joining, and don't forget to register to join us at the summit. Lots more business sustainability case studies, local and global. And it's November 8th at the Monona Terrace. And we'll definitely send a follow-up email with the recording and contact info, so you'll get your questions answered later. All right. Thank you, everybody. I'm going to end the meeting so the recording ends.